welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of Deep South Texas. Got a great program lined up for you today in just a few moments. Our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, is going to be speaking with both Christina Aiello and Myles Traphagen of the Wildlands Network. We're looking forward to that conversation in just a bit. But as always, we're going to go through some headlines. But before we begin today's headlines, I do want to warn you this very first story that we are going to tell you about. Some of you at home listening or watching this may consider this story a little disturbing. So if you are a little sensitive to certain topics in the news, you may want to take this time to go ahead and hit the mute button, or maybe skip ahead if you're listening to the audio version of this on your podcast device. But we begin with this shocking story out of Juarez, Mexico, where a U.S. official is accusing a woman jailed on femicide charges of leading a baby trafficking ring on behalf of a drug cartel. Now, Marta Alicia Mendez Aguilar, better known as La Diabla, was arrested in Juarez earlier this month on charges of human trafficking for allegedly recruiting a 16-year-old girl for criminal activities. A week later, she was charged with the July murder of a 20-year-old pregnant woman. The victim, whose body was pulled from the backyard of a home, was allegedly subjected to a C-section prior to being killed. La Diabla is accused of being a member of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Her arrest was part of an operation that disrupted an infant trafficking network that lured pregnant women to remote locations, performed illegal cesarean procedures, harvested the organs from the mother's bodies, and sold the newborns to couples in the United States for up to $13,000. Also happening across the border, Texas Department of Public Safety troopers say they stopped a box truck in rural Zapata County and found several Mexican migrants being smuggled inside a false compartment in the vehicle. A 24-year-old Honduran national was arrested and charged with felony smuggling. DPS troopers say the suspect had 4 migrants who had crossed the border illegally, hiding in a compartment cut behind the front seats of the truck's cab. The truck was filled with water tanks and also had an expired license tag. Moving on to our next story, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is in Juarez this afternoon, briefing people that live there about work in her first year in office. She's at a rally at the Juarez Monument Park, which is where she held one of her largest rallies while running for office last year. Sheinbaum will now travel to Mexicali in Baja California State and the Mexican Pacific Coast cities, including Mazatlan, which mostly has been spared by a drug war raging in the Sinaloa state capital of Culiacan. Time now to bring in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, as well as our 2 guests. Salvador, I'll let you go ahead and introduce them.
Thank you, Rudy. Always good to be with you. Appreciate it. So with us, special afternoon, you're about to find out a lot of good stuff about what happens along the border in regards to our nature, wildlife, the flora, the fauna that does exist along the southern border. It's not all controversial stuff. It's not all about immigration. It's about beautiful stuff that does live and thrive along the border. Unfortunately, there are a few things that are sort of beyond our control that are threatening to wreck what is happening here along our southern border. Let me introduce our guests. It's Christina Aiello and Myles Traphagen. They are with Wildlands Network. And why don't I start with you, Myles? Why don't you kind of fill us in on what you do when you're not being part of our Border Report live stream?
Well, I've been working the border beat, as you would say, as a biologist for over 20 years now in southeastern Arizona. I'm based out of Tucson, and I started my career with Fish and Wildlife in Douglas. So I was right on the Sonora border, and so my family is binational, and so I spend quite a bit of time on both sides of the line. I've been doing research in collaboration with others, looking at the effects of the U.S.-Mexico border wall. And that first started out by mapping the border. And so when they were doing border wall construction, I guess I would call it during Trump 1.0, I mapped the border from California through Arizona and New Mexico. And that was on the ground and using drones and high-resolution satellite imagery so we could produce very accurate maps. And the reason for that is because we're really interested in wildlife connectivity. And Wildlands Network has been around for about 30 years, and it's an organization that's committed to maintaining habitat and wildlife connectivity and corridors for a lot of our largest animals here in North America. And the U.S.-Mexico borderlands are incredibly diverse. I think there's sort of a stereotypical image that it's a desert wasteland. It's sand dunes and saguaro cactus, and nothing could be further from the truth. There's a huge range of habitats, probably 12, 15 different biotic communities from here to the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And since we're at the southern end of the temperate zones and the northern end of the neotropical zones of Mexico, we get a blend of a lot of different species, plants and animals, and including, black bears, which are a very iconic North American temperate species, and then the jaguar, which reaches its northern limit in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, and formerly in Texas, and that it would be, a tropical species. So I like to say that I work in a place where the jaguar and the black bear share the same path.
Amazing stuff. So, as we look at some images that were taken by you and Christina, why don't we let Christina tell us about what you've been doing the last few days? And I guess you're based in California. Tell us about your work, Christina.
Yes, thank you. I'm based in Joshua Tree, California, and my expertise is in primarily desert wildlife. And I've been studying the wildlife in Southern California for about 15 years now. So what Myles and I had been doing was assessing kind of the conditions of the border wall all across the border, but primarily focusing on these regions that are unfenced currently, but have been approved via waivers for new fence construction. And we're really concerned about the effects this is going to have on some of California and Baja California's most iconic large mammal species, particularly peninsular bighorn sheep, as well as mountain lion and mule deer. These are large animals that cannot get through this border fence. You can see the gaps in that fence wall are just about the size of my fist, very small. So large animal like bighorn sheep's not going to be able to pass through. So we are documenting kind of these key areas that species like bighorn sheep are really reliant on to move back and forth between their habitat in California as well as in Baja California, and to try and make some proposals to DHS as to what we can do to preserve some of this connectivity for these key species.
Mhm. Myles, you described the first Trump administration, and you were working back then. What did you see back then? What was the extent of the damage or destruction, for lack of a better term, that you saw, that you witnessed when the walls first started going up?
It was an incredible amount of destruction and really heartbreaking to see, especially in an area where you've staked a lot of your career in conservation and preservation of natural spaces. They built approximately 450 miles of border wall. And contrary to popular belief or kind of what a lot of the media was promulgating, was that they called it replacement fencing. And in a lot of places, there were vehicle barriers, which are like they call them a Normandy fence. It's the crossbars that you would see using old railroad ties. That was not a problem for animals and wildlife to traverse. But then when they did the replacement fencing, and now you've got a 30-foot border wall with only 4-inch gaps between it, there's simply no comparison. So during that time period, I saw a lot of mountains literally blown up on National Park Service properties and wilderness areas in order to build border walls. And it's really unfortunate that we take the approach of maintaining a line of scrimmage versus, even the Great Wall of China used natural barriers to, go around an existing cliff where when they built the border wall here in a lot of very remote, steep terrain, they ended up blasting roadways and creating switchbacks to access that area in order to build the border wall. And some of our initial reports from our camera trap data, we have these trail cameras, a network of those along the border. I was actually detecting more human crossings after the border wall because roads were created to go into places that were sort of, untraversable. So it's really a destructive way of approaching immigration and border security, and especially when there was already an existing multi-million dollar, hundreds of million dollars network of integrated fixed towers, which were doing this job electronically with radar and sensing and high resolution cameras and infrared. And now with these giant border walls, we're basically altering the evolutionary history of the continent by impeding the movement of wildlife between the two countries in a place that's really sort of a pinch point for animal migration in Western North America.
Christina, we are looking at images we're just looking at stuff from Otay Mesa, which is the eastern part of San Diego County, right along the border. What have you seen in California as a result of the wall? How has it affected animal life or just in general, the environment out there?
Yeah, so that's one of the big challenges with documenting the effects of the wall is that it is constructed so rapidly and without these assessments that we often don't have good preliminary data or studies ongoing before the wall was constructed. So now we're kind of documenting the after effects without a real knowledge of what the animals were doing beforehand. But what we can tell is that a lot of these species, for one, can't make it through these fences, and that's especially these larger species. But as well as species like coyote, fox, badger, these small fence openings are not large enough for those animals. So for some of these species, their home ranges pretty much exist right on the border. So it's cut off the habitat that they used to access, the resources that they used to access. And that causes long-term problems for under the conditions of climate change, under the conditions of increasing habitat loss and fragmentation. These animals really need all the resources they can get. And with this additional barrier, we're creating even more challenges. So in the long term, it reduces their resiliency, increases the likelihood that populations are at risk of extinction or at risk of becoming endangered.
hmm Myles, I asked you this yesterday, as a matter of fact, when we were together for a little bit. Why should people care or perhaps put more of an emphasis, more importance on the animals and the wildlife than the border and the immigration issues that our country is having?
Well, for one, we're dealing with a global socioeconomic issue when it comes to immigration. It's basically, the transfer of economies and energy, because, energy moves in certain directions, where there's a surplus or a deficit. So that we're essentially seeing that same dynamic here. And the places where the border wall has been built happens to be a lot of protected federal lands and state lands. They are wilderness areas, National Park Service properties, national forests, national grasslands. And these were set aside by Congress and our government and the people for conservation of nature. And in some cases, also historical and cultural preservation, such as Coronado National Memorial in southeastern Arizona, which commemorates the Coronado expedition, which arrived in 1540. So there's a reason that these places were conserved, and this preserves our natural world. It preserves biodiversity and all the workings of nature. And I think a lot of people are very invested in this, and they're not even aware of it. So uh, somebody needs to really remind the American public that we gain benefits from nature, whether it's water conservation and cleanliness and watersheds, a lot of different reasons. But we set aside these as a collective, as a nation. And the fact that the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is an unelected appointed official, can waive away all the laws like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act to build barriers, that's simply un-American. It's not representative of our democracy.
We're speaking with Christina Aiello and Myles Traphagen of the Wildlands Network about the environmental impact that the border wall has on the environment. Stay with us, though. We're going to take a quick break. Border Report Live will be back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. Joining myself and our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, is Christina Aiello and Myles Traphagen of the Wildlands Network, here to talk about the environmental impact of the border wall.
Well, recently, the Wildlands Network put out some information about how the migration of big animals has been reduced by 86% or so. One of those species is big horned sheep. Now, Christina, tell us about how these beautiful animals are being impacted because they can't traverse their natural home.
Yeah, bighorn sheep are one of the species we think is going to be the most affected if the California border is completely walled off. And right now, the species is already being impacted because Southern California is already developed, it's fragmented. And so these southern populations of bighorn are listed as endangered, federally endangered, because they're becoming more and more isolated. Now, at the moment, some of the sections of the border that are unfenced occur right in this desert bighorn habitat, and it allows connectivity between the populations in California and Baja California. And it's pretty much a continuous string of habitat. The populations are interacting regularly. There's a population that occurs right on the border that actually accesses water on the Mexico side and then spends the rest of its year on the U.S. side. And so if this section of border is completely walled off, what we're going to see is increasing impacts, not just on this local population, but we're going to completely cut off bighorn that occur in California from bighorn in Mexico. And this is a very culturally and economically significant species. It's really coveted by outdoorsmen and hunter groups. Currently, because they're listed, they can't be hunted, but if they were to be recovered and populations were to increase, that might be a future possibility. In Mexico, the ejidos are very concerned and interested in being more engaged in bighorn conservation because this is not only a potential economic resource if hunting opportunities were to open up in the future, but it's also a culturally significant animal for a lot of indigenous cultures on both sides of the border.
Interesting. Now, Myles, we have discussed, you have told us about these solutions that you're also proposing. You're not about investigating or perhaps pointing fingers. You're also about creating, suggesting solutions to mitigate this. Tell us about these trapdoor idea that you have that does allow not the bigger animals perhaps, but some animals, some species are able to get through the border fence because of these openings, this crevices, if you will, that have been put into the base of the wall in certain areas.
Yeah, so in certain areas along the border, mainly in Arizona, there are things called small wildlife passages. And the Department of Homeland Security and its contractors put these in the border wall a few years ago, and they're very small. They're only 8 by 11 inches, so the size of a standard piece of paper. And we discovered in our research with Sky Island Alliance, another conservation organization in Arizona, that a lot more wildlife were using these small openings than we anticipated. And what really just kind of blew everybody away is when we saw mountain lions go through there. We have a video of a mother mountain lion and her 3 kittens that are going through there. And she basically just looks at it and does a downward facing cat, as you would call in yoga. And she makes her way through there. So what we're trying to do is to be proactive to find, solutions and some way to mitigate the impacts of the border wall. And we've had discussions with the Department of Homeland Security for several years now. There's a lot of great people in the environmental department of DHS who are concerned and who do care. And so when we presented them with hundreds of videos of animals utilizing these, it really inspired them to try to go the extra mile to install more of these structures, these small wildlife passages, in addition to keeping larger floodgates open seasonally so that we can facilitate migration of larger animals.
Okay, wonderful. And if you want to see that video, we have it on borderreport.com. We were going to have it for you on this live stream, but we had some issues, so we apologize about that. It is a striking video, and you do see an example of how we can help if we really put our minds to it. Now, Christina, what happens if DHS, Department of Homeland Security, does go ahead and puts up these barriers everywhere? Yesterday, we were talking about how like 98% of the entire California, Baja California border will be sealed off. How devastating is that going to be?
I would say it would be quite problematic, but it's not irreversible. I mean, we are gathering data right now to help us pinpoint where are these key locations that some of these larger and smaller wildlife need. And even if the wall is completely built today, we can go back and we can add these openings. I mean, this isn't a permanent situation. So we're just going to keep pushing for this and keep asking for these openings to be put in, whether that's this administration or future administration, because this is going to be a gradual process and its effect for wildlife. There will be some individuals immediately affected, those that are cut off from some of those resources like the water holes that Bighorn are accessing. So that might affect individual survival, their ability to reproduce. But in the long term, this is going to be a slow process to where populations become more and more genetically isolated, and that's going to be a kind of a gradual thing. And that's why it's kind of hard to call for these things, because you don't see it immediately. You don't see dead animals just littering the ground. This is going to be a process that occurs over multiple decades, but it's going to have substantial effects where wildlife populations are going to be more at risk in the long term.
Myles, aesthetically, the wall is not very pretty to look at. Aside from the problems it presents for animals, wildlife, what other issues does the wall create out there in the desert or in the mountains along our southern border?
It has a lot of human impacts. I'm really concerned about children who grow up in the shadow of a border wall. And you see this when you're in the urban areas such as Tijuana and some parts of San Diego, but mainly in the other side. But when you get into South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, I've been down there in McAllen and Brownsville, and people have border walls literally in their backyards. And my biggest concern is that if that becomes normalized for kids who've grown up and they never knew what it was like not to live in the shadow of a border wall and to, have helicopters buzzing around all night and concertina razor wire on the wall, what's going to be the long-term impact on their psyche, on their development, on their view of the world? So that's a major concern of mine. Another concern is the water use and energy-intensive use for construction of the border walls. There's a place called San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge in southeastern Arizona, and it has ponds to protect endangered native fishes for the Rio Yaqui drainage. They were using about 700,000 gallons a day when they constructed the border wall there. And what happened was when the border wall was complete, the artesian wells that had flowed for thousands of years under their own pressure, those ceased to flow, and they had to install submersible solar-powered pumps in order to maintain that flow. So basically, since 2020, ironically, in the year of COVID, when it came about, the refuge has been on a ventilator.
Well said. Now, Christina mentioned that perhaps there is still time to make a difference to stop all these negative issues. Can we really survive more border walls and another 3 years of construction or refurbishing of the walls that are there? We're talking about black paint on the bollards that do make up the border wall. Can we survive this in the years ahead? Christina, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think completing the wall is not ideal. And even if we get these openings in, I mean, it's a bit of a Band-Aid on a larger problem. So it might reduce the negative effects on some species, but there's going to be a net negative of the completion of this border wall. That's without a doubt, and that's going to be not just on wildlife, but on the communities surrounding the wall and the water resources and other resources that Myles mentioned. So I think even if we take the best measures we can at the moment by adding in these openings where we can and the border walls constructed, I don't think we're winning in the long run.
We've been speaking with Christina Aiello and Myles Traphagen of the Wildlands Network about the environmental impacts that the border wall has all along the U.S.-Mexico border. We just wanted to thank you all so much for your time, and we appreciate you all being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right. Well, stay with us, though. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. Welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles. I'm your host here in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. What a great program. Thanks to our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, and our guests, of course, Mr. Myles Traphagen and Miss Christina Aiello of the Wildlands Network for that incredibly the incredible information about the environmental impact that the border wall has all along the U.S.-Mexico border. Got some things to tell you about before we go today, starting with we want to remind you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. It's a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Next Star's Director of Political Content and my boss, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data. Now, this week's episode focuses on the New Jersey governor's race with a new poll from Emerson College Polling. So if you're a political junkie, you're not going to want to miss it. So make sure to check it out. You can find more on Political Power Ranker at abc27.com, or you can check your local Nexstar station's website. And real quick, just a reminder, you can stay informed on the stories shaping the U.S.-Mexico border on your commute or on your run or while you're at the gym. We're available in podcast form now at those places at the bottom of your screen. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.